The conference room stretched for what seemed like miles, with representatives from 47 different species sitting in their designated sections. Commander Jake Harrison sat in the human observation area watching the Galactic Council argue about the same thing they had been arguing about for 3 days straight. The Zentaur raiders had attacked another colony station 2 weeks ago and killed over 200 people, including women and children from multiple species. The bodies were still being identified when the council decided to hold another debate about what should be done. Jake rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the datapad in front of him. Lieutenant Amy Chen had sent him the latest reports from the outer colonies, and the news was not good. 5 more attacks in the last month alone, and the council was still talking about forming a subcommittee to study the issue. He watched as the council chair called for another vote on whether they should consider economic sanctions against the Zentaur homeworlds, and Jake felt something inside him snap. The Vexari chairman Qualzen stood at the center podium with his scales shifting between blue and purple as he tried to maintain order in the chamber. A representative from the Kathari Collective was arguing with a delegate from the Marine Empire about proper protocol for addressing piracy in neutral space. Neither of them seemed to care that actual people were dying while they debated procedural minutiae. Jake stood up slowly, and the movement caught the attention of several nearby delegates. He walked calmly to the communication booth, reserved for the human delegation, and pulled up a secure channel to Earth Command. His fingers moved across the holographic keyboard as he typed out a brief message that would change everything. The message was simple and direct, in the way that only humans seemed to communicate when they had reached the end of their patience. Admiral Lisa Hayes was reviewing fleet deployments in her office at Strategic Command when the message arrived. She read the 3 words on her screen and allowed herself a small smile. She had known Jake Harrison for 15 years and had served with him during the border wars. When Jake used those particular words, it meant that diplomacy had failed, and it was time for a different approach. She pressed the intercom button on her desk, and her aide commander Peter Brooks appeared in the doorway within seconds. Lisa looked up at him with an expression that he had learned to recognize over the years. It was the look that meant someone somewhere had pushed humanity too far and was about to learn a valuable lesson about consequences. The orders went out within minutes through encrypted military channels that only Earth fleet commanders could access. Captain Ryan Foster was in his quarters aboard the USS Defender when his personal comm unit buzzed with an Alpha priority message. He read the deployment orders twice to make sure he understood them correctly, then headed straight for the bridge. His crew was already moving to battle stations before he even arrived, because they had learned to recognize the particular alarm pattern that meant real action was coming. Back at the council chamber, Ambassador Helen Price had taken Jake's place at the main delegation table. She sat with her hands folded in front of her, while the debate continued around her. The Saurian representative was now arguing that any military action would require at least 6 months of planning and coordination between council forces. Helen waited for him to finish his speech before she raised her hand to request permission to speak. Qualzen recognized her with obvious reluctance because the human delegation had been unusually quiet during the proceedings. Helen stood and addressed the chamber in a clear, calm voice that carried to every corner of the massive room. She explained that humanity had decided to address the Zentaur situation directly, since the council seemed unable to reach a consensus on any meaningful action. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The Cathari representative actually fell from his hovering platform in shock and had to be helped up by his aides. 3 different species began shouting objections simultaneously, while their translators struggled to keep up with the flood of panicked voices. Qualzen's scales flushed a deep purple that indicated extreme distress among his people, and he demanded to know what exactly the humans had done. Helen explained patiently that Earth's Rapid Response Fleet had been activated and was currently preparing for deployment to the outer territories. She noted that humanity had given the Council 3 full days to approve some kind of action, and had decided that waiting any longer would result in more innocent deaths. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Across the galaxy, automated alert systems began triggering as intelligence networks detected the sudden spike in human military communications. The Marine Collective's Defense Ministry picked up the encrypted traffic patterns within minutes and immediately escalated the information to their high command. The Draconian clans detected unusual movement in human fleet positions and went to a defensive posture. Even the normally confident Saurian Empire activated their planetary shield networks. The galaxy had learned through hard experience that when humans said they would handle something, it meant that restraint and caution were about to take a back seat to efficiency and overwhelming force. There were legends still told in military academies about the last time humanity had decided to handle a problem on their own. A 300-year-old conflict had ended in 6 weeks, with human forces demonstrating a level of tactical creativity and strategic ruthlessness that shocked every other species. Captain Ryan Foster stood on the bridge of the Defender, reviewing the tactical data his crew had compiled. 23 ships had been assigned to the task force, and every single one of them was crewed by personnel who had volunteered for the mission. They were tired of watching the casualty reports come in while politicians argued about proper procedure. They were ready to do something about it. The navigation officer plotted the course to the Zentar border territories, while the weapons officer ran final checks on all combat systems. The chief engineer reported that the ship's FTL drives were operating at peak efficiency and ready for maximum burn. Ryan looked at the faces of his bridge crew and saw the same determination reflected in all of them. He gave the order to proceed, and the Defender's engines flared to life with a brilliance that could be seen from the nearby station. One by one, the other ships in the task force followed suit, until 23 human warships were burning hard toward the outer rim. They were not going to negotiate or threaten or debate. They were going to handle the problem in the most direct way possible. Behind them at the council station, the emergency session continued with representatives demanding explanations and assurances and protocols. Helen Price sat quietly through it all, knowing that words no longer mattered. The time for talking had passed 3 days ago. Now it was time to show the galaxy what happened when humanity ran out of patience. The Galactic Intelligence Network detected the shift in human communications exactly 17 minutes after Admiral Lisa Hayes gave the deployment order. Automated systems flagged the change in encryption patterns and traffic volume, then forwarded the alerts to every major government in known space. Within an hour, every species with any kind of military capability knew that humanity had activated something big, and the panic spread faster than light itself. The Council's own security division brought the news to Chairman Qualzen, while he was still trying to restore order to the emergency session. His chief of security was a normally calm Frelian named Bextar, who prided himself on never showing emotion. The fact that Bextar's face had gone completely pale made Qualzen's blood run cold even before he heard the report. Human fleet movements on this scale had not been seen since the end of the border wars, and that conflict had ended with 3 entire star systems being restructured. The security briefing included estimates of how many ships Earth might be deploying, and every estimate made Qualzen feel worse. The lowest projection was 15 vessels, and the highest was close to 50. Either number represented more firepower than most species could muster for a full-scale war. Ambassador Helen Price watched the panic spread through the council chamber with an expression of studied neutrality. She had been briefed on what to expect when the deployment was detected and had prepared her responses accordingly. When Qualzen demanded an explanation, she simply repeated what she had said before, with a few additional details that did nothing to calm anyone down. The Saurian delegate stood up so fast that his chair fell over backward and demanded that the humans cease all military operations immediately. His voice carried the authority of an empire that controlled 12 star systems and had never been successfully challenged in open warfare. Helen looked at him calmly and asked if the Saurian Empire would be willing to deploy their own forces to stop the Zentar raids. The delegate sat back down without answering. A representative from the Draconian clans asked what targets the human fleet intended to strike, and Helen told him honestly that she did not have that information. The tactical planning was being handled by military command, and they did not share operational details with the diplomatic corps. This answer somehow made everyone even more nervous, because it meant the humans were treating this as an actual military operation, rather than a political maneuver. The Cathari Collective's delegate recovered from his earlier fall and began citing council regulations about unauthorized military action in neutral space. He read from a datapad that contained what appeared to be hundreds of specific rules and protocols that humanity was allegedly violating. Helen listened politely until he finished, then pointed out that every regulation he cited included exceptions for emergency response to ongoing threats against civilian populations. Across the galaxy, military commanders were having emergency meetings with their civilian leadership to discuss what the human deployment meant for their own security. The Marine Collective pulled back every ship within 10 light-years of human space and established a defensive perimeter around their core worlds. Their high command sent a message to Admiral Hayes requesting assurance that Marine territory would not be affected by human operations. Lisa sent back a one-sentence response stating that humanity had no quarrel with the Marine and asked them to stay out of the way. The Draconian clans had a different reaction born from their warrior culture and pride. Their war chief wanted to send observers to watch the human fleet in action because Draconian military doctrine emphasized learning from skilled opponents. The clan elders overruled him and ordered a full withdrawal from the border regions. They remembered the stories their ancestors told about fighting alongside humans during the Hive Wars, and those stories always emphasized the same point, which was that humans in combat were creative, brutal, and utterly relentless. Captain Ryan Foster brought the Defender out of FTL at the edge of the Kelthar system and immediately went to full stealth mode. His sensor officer began scanning for any sign of Xentar activity, while the tactical team updated their targeting solutions. The rest of the task force emerged from faster-than-light travel in a carefully staggered pattern designed to minimize detection. The intelligence reports indicated that Xentar raiders operated from hidden bases in the nebula regions and only emerged when they had identified vulnerable targets. Their standard pattern was to hit fast with overwhelming numbers, then disappear before any organized response could reach them. It was a strategy that worked well against the slow and cautious approach that most Council species used for military operations. Ryan studied the tactical display on his command screen and considered the problem. The Xentar were expecting to face opponents who would follow predictable patterns and wait for authorization before engaging. They were about to learn that humans did not operate according to those same assumptions. He gave orders to begin active sensor sweeps of the entire system, with all ships broadcasting on channels that the raiders would certainly be monitoring. Commander Kate Sullivan questioned the wisdom of announcing their presence so obviously, but Ryan explained the strategy. The Xentar needed to know that someone was hunting them, and that someone was not going to follow the usual rules. Fear was a weapon, just like missiles and guns, and right now he wanted the enemy to be very afraid. Kate smiled and increased the power to the sensor arrays. Back at the Council station, the emergency session had been going on for 6 hours straight, without any resolution. Multiple species had proposed various responses to the human deployment, ranging from economic sanctions, to formal censure, to actually sending Council forces to stop the human fleet by force. Helen Price listened to each proposal, and voted against all of them, while providing detailed explanations of why each idea was impractical, illegal, or just plain stupid. The Vex Ari chairman tried to find some middle ground that would satisfy everyone, but the reality was that no middle ground existed. Half the Council wanted humanity punished for taking unilateral action, while the other half secretly hoped the humans would succeed in stopping the raids. No one was willing to say it out loud, but everyone knew that the Council had failed to protect its own citizens, and humanity was now doing the job that the Council should have done. Ambassador Jake Harrison received a secure message from Admiral Hayes with an update on the fleet's position and status. He read it quickly, then deleted it from his datapad before anyone could ask what he had been looking at. The message confirmed that all ships were in position and ready to begin operations. It also included a personal note from Lisa reminding him that politicians could complain all they wanted, but the mission would continue until it was complete. A junior aide from the Frelian delegation approached Helen during a brief recess and asked quietly if the humans really intended to fight the entire Xentar fleet. Helen considered the question carefully before answering, because the young Frelian seemed genuinely curious rather than accusatory. She explained that humanity would do whatever was necessary to stop the raids and protect innocent lives. The aide nodded slowly and said that his own family lived on one of the colony worlds that had been attacked. He hoped the humans would succeed where the Council had failed. The session resumed with yet another delegate calling for the humans to withdraw their forces and return to proper diplomatic channels. Helen stood to respond, but before she could speak, her communication device buzzed with an incoming priority message. She glanced at the screen and allowed herself a small smile. The message was from Captain Ryan Foster, and it contained 2 words that changed everything. Contact made. The Zentaur raiding party consisted of 5 ships hunting a Freilian cargo convoy near the edge of the nebula when the Defender dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above them. There were no warnings broadcast and no attempts at communication. Captain Ryan Foster had reviewed the intelligence reports about what the Zentaur did to their victims and decided that talking was a waste of time that could be better spent ending the threat. Commander Kate Sullivan called out targets from her tactical station with the calm efficiency of someone who had trained for this moment her entire career. The Defender's main batteries locked onto the lead raider ship and fired before the Zentaur even realized they were under attack. The first volley of missiles struck the raider's engines and turned them into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. The second volley hit 3 seconds later and broke the ship's spine. The other 4 raider ships scattered in different directions while trying to bring their own weapons online, but they had been caught completely by surprise. 2 of them attempted to flee deeper into the nebula, where the heavy particle concentrations would make targeting more difficult. The remaining 2 ships turned to fight probably because their captains realized that running from something as fast as a human destroyer was pointless. Ryan gave the order to launch interceptors, and 8 small craft shot out from the Defender's launch bays. They were piloted by some of the best flight officers in Earth's Navy, and they moved through space with a grace that made combat look like a carefully choreographed dance. The interceptors split into 2 groups, with one chasing the fleeing raiders and the other providing support for the Defender's attack on the ships that had chosen to fight. Lieutenant Commander Ben Carter led the pursuit team into the nebula and pushed his interceptor's engines far beyond what the safety specifications recommended. His wingman, Lieutenant Nicole Grant, stayed tight on his left flank while they tracked the energy signatures of the fleeing Zentaur ships. The nebula made sensor readings unreliable, but human pilots had learned to trust their instincts when technology failed them. Back at the main engagement, the Defender circled the 2 remaining raider ships like a shark that had scented blood in the water. The Zentaur fired everything they had at the human destroyer, but their weapons were designed for attacking helpless cargo ships rather than military vessels with modern shielding. Ryan watched the tactical display as enemy fire splashed harmlessly against his ship's defensive screens and felt nothing but cold determination. Kate targeted the engines on both ships with precision that would have impressed the instructors at the Naval Academy. She explained to the bridge crew that disabled ships could be boarded and searched for intelligence while destroyed ships told you nothing useful. Ryan approved the strategy and gave her permission to proceed. Within 2 minutes, both raider ships were drifting in space with their power systems offline, and their crews probably wondering what had just happened to them. Deep in the nebula, Ben Carter finally caught up with one of the fleeing raiders and sent a targeting lock warning to the enemy ship. The Zentaur captain responded by attempting a desperate evasive maneuver that might have worked against a slower opponent. Ben adjusted his trajectory without even thinking about it, and put 3 shots into the raider's maneuvering thrusters. The enemy ship began spinning out of control, and the captain apparently decided that capture was preferable to dying in a crash. The second fleeing raider was not so lucky, or perhaps its captain was more desperate. When Nicole Grant locked weapons on the ship, its captain activated the self-destruct sequence rather than surrender. The explosion was visible even through the nebula's interference, and Nicole reported the destruction with a hint of regret in her voice. She had wanted to capture both ships but understood that sometimes the enemy made choices that left no other option. The boarding teams from the Defender secured the disabled raider ships within 20 minutes and began pulling data from their navigation computers. What they found made even the experienced Marines angry. The ships had detailed logs of over 30 different raids, including timestamps, locations, and lists of what they had stolen. Some of the entries included casual notes about how many people had been killed, as if the Zentaur captains were keeping score. One of the captured ships had what the Marines initially thought was a storage locker, but turned out to be something much worse. Inside were personal items taken from victims during the raids, including things that clearly belonged to children. Toys and clothes and small treasures that families had probably searched for desperately in the aftermath of attacks. The Marine sergeant who opened the locker had to step away for a moment to control his reaction. Ryan received the preliminary reports from the boarding teams and felt his jaw tighten with suppressed rage. He had seen combat before and understood that war was brutal and ugly, but there was a difference between soldiers fighting soldiers and predators hunting helpless civilians. The Zentaur had crossed a line that humanity considered unforgivable, and now they were going to learn what happened when you made humans genuinely angry. He sent a secure transmission back to Admiral Hayes with the captured navigation data and a request for permission to expand operations. The data showed locations for multiple Xentar bases and supply depots scattered across 3 different star systems. If the task force moved quickly, they could hit a dozen targets before the enemy had time to realize what was happening. Lisa's response came back within minutes, and it was exactly what Ryan had hoped to hear, which was a single word that gave him everything he needed to know. The word was proceed. Back at the council station, Ambassador Helen Price was fielding angry questions from delegates who had learned about the engagement through their intelligence services. The Vex-Ari chairman demanded to know how many Xentar ships had been destroyed, and whether the humans had attempted to negotiate before opening fire. Helen provided the exact numbers and explained that negotiation with pirates actively attacking civilians was not something humanity considered a priority. A representative from the Saurian Empire stood and declared that the human action set a dangerous precedent for unilateral military operations. Helen listened patiently, then asked if the Saurian Empire would prefer that humanity had waited for council approval while the Freljin cargo ships were destroyed and their crews killed. The Saurian delegate had no good answer to that question and sat down while muttering something about proper procedure. Jake Harrison watched the proceedings from the observation area and felt a grim satisfaction at how uncomfortable the council had become. They had spent decades building a system based on consensus and careful deliberation. And that system worked reasonably well for most situations. But when speed and decisiveness were required, the council's approach failed completely, and everyone in the chamber knew it, even if most of them were not willing to admit it. The Cathari delegate proposed that the council send observers to monitor human military operations and ensure compliance with galactic law. Helen agreed immediately to the proposal, which surprised everyone, including the Cathari representative himself. She explained that humanity had nothing to hide and would welcome independent verification that all operations were being conducted within legal boundaries. The delegate seemed unsure whether he had just won a victory or walked into a trap. What none of them knew was that Admiral Hayes had already instructed all task force commanders to document every action with the kind of detailed record-keeping that would satisfy even the most aggressive investigation. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle accusations of impropriety was to provide so much documentation that accusers drowned in evidence of proper procedure. If the council wanted to review human operations, they would get reports so thorough and comprehensive that it would take them months to read everything. Captain Ryan Foster prepared his ships to move to the next target on the list, which was a Xentar supply depot in the Vega system. The intelligence from the captured ships indicated that the depot serviced at least 6 different raiding groups and contained stockpiles of stolen goods waiting to be sold on black markets. He gave the order to jump to faster-than-light travel, and the Defender's engines flared bright against the darkness of space. Behind him, the task force followed in perfect formation, ready to handle whatever came next. The human task force hit 17 different Xentar positions over the next 48 hours, and each attack followed the same pattern of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Captain Ryan Foster led from the front, while his commanders adapted tactics based on what they learned from each engagement. The Xentar were discovering that fighting an enemy who refused to follow predictable patterns was far more difficult than raiding defenseless cargo ships. Commander Kate Sullivan developed a reputation among the task force crews for being able to disable enemy ships without destroying them, which meant more intelligence could be gathered from captured databases. She explained her technique to other tactical officers during the brief rest periods between jumps, and soon every ship in the fleet was using variations of her targeting solutions. The result was that human forces were building a comprehensive picture of the entire Xentar operation with each raid. The supply depot in the Vega system turned out to be more heavily defended than expected, with 6 ships providing security and automated defense platforms covering the approaches. Ryan studied the tactical situation and decided that a direct assault would cost too many lives for minimal gain. Instead, he ordered the task force to conduct a feint from one direction, while a smaller strike team approached from an unexpected angle. Lieutenant Commander Ben Carter led the strike team in what he privately thought was either brilliant strategy or complete insanity. His 3 interceptors approached the depot using the debris field from an old mining operation as cover, while the main fleet drew the defenders' attention. The plan relied on the Zentaur being so focused on the obvious threat that they missed the subtle one, and fortunately, the enemy commander cooperated by committing all his forces to meet the defenders' advance. Ben's team reached weapons range of the defense platforms without being detected, and launched a coordinated strike that took out 4 of the 6 installations before the Zentaur realized what was happening. The confusion created by losing half their automated defenses gave the main fleet the opening they needed, and the defender pushed through, with her escorts close behind. The battle was over in less than 15 minutes, with all 6 defending ships either captured or destroyed. The depot itself contained exactly what the intelligence had suggested, which was warehouses full of stolen goods waiting to be sold. There were also detailed records showing a network of buyers and smugglers who helped move the stolen property through legitimate markets. Commander Sarah Blake, who was leading the investigation teams, sent the data back to Admiral Hayes, with a note suggesting that Earth's law enforcement agencies might be interested in some of the names on the buyer lists. What disturbed the boarding teams more than the stolen cargo was another trophy room similar to what they had found on the raider ships. This one was larger and more organized, with items sorted by species and dated to show when they had been taken. The Marine who found a section containing children's belongings from the most recent attack requested permission to burn the entire depot to the ground. Ryan approved the request after all useful intelligence had been extracted. Across the galaxy, the Zentaur Confederacy was beginning to understand that they faced a threat unlike anything they had encountered before. Their warlord Krax called an emergency meeting of his senior captains and demanded to know how human forces were finding their hidden bases. No one had good answers, because the Zentaur had never considered that an enemy might be able to move fast enough to hit multiple targets before warnings could be spread. Krax decided to consolidate his remaining forces at his main base in the Kelthar system, which was hidden in an asteroid field and protected by the largest concentration of ships he could muster. He sent messages to his scattered raiding groups, ordering them to return immediately and prepare for a defensive battle. Some of his captains questioned whether defense was the right strategy, but Krax silenced them with threats of execution. He had built his power on fear and intimidation, and those tools had always worked before. What Krax did not understand was that gathering all his forces in one location was exactly what Ryan Foster had been hoping he would do. The captured intelligence had revealed the location of the main base weeks ago, but attacking it while Zentaur ships were scattered across multiple systems would have meant leaving threats active behind the advancing human fleet. Now the enemy was doing the work of concentrating targets for him, and Ryan felt confident that the end of this campaign was approaching. At the council station, the emergency session had finally ended after 3 days of continuous debate, but the regular council meetings were now dominated by discussions of human military activities. Chairman Qualzen found himself in the awkward position of defending humanity's actions to species who wanted them condemned, while simultaneously trying to maintain some appearance of council authority over the situation. Ambassador Helen Price attended the sessions and provided regular updates on task force operations with a level of detail that some delegates found excessive. She explained each engagement, including which ships had been destroyed, which had been captured, and what intelligence had been gained. The transparency was deliberate because it made accusations of improper conduct much harder to sustain when everything was being documented and shared openly. The Cathari observers who had been sent to monitor human operations sent back reports that confused their government more than clarifying anything. The observers confirmed that human forces were following all established rules of engagement, and actually seemed to be more careful about civilian casualties than many council species would have been. They also reported that human tactical doctrine emphasized speed and aggression in ways that made traditional military theory seem outdated. A delegate from the Marine Collective asked Helen if humanity intended to occupy any of the territory they were clearing of Zentaur presence. The question revealed the underlying fear that many species had, which was that humans might use this operation as an excuse to expand their own territory. Helen assured the Council that Earth had no interest in claiming new worlds, and would withdraw all forces once the raiding threat was eliminated. She did not add that humanity would also be installing monitoring stations to ensure the Zentaur did not return, but saw no reason to mention that detail unless asked directly. Captain Ryan Foster reviewed the latest intelligence on the Kelthar base and did not like what he saw. The asteroid field provided excellent cover for defending ships, and the base itself was built into one of the larger asteroids, which made it difficult to target effectively. His tactical team estimated that a direct assault would succeed, but casualties would be significant. He spent several hours considering alternatives before making a decision that surprised his senior officers. He sent a message directly to Krax Nor, offering one chance for the Zentaur warlord to surrender himself and his forces for trial under galactic law. The message promised that crews who surrendered would be treated as prisoners of war rather than pirates if they cooperated immediately. It also made clear that refusal would result in the complete destruction of the base and everyone in it. Ryan gave Krax Nor 12 hours to respond. Commander Kate Sullivan questioned the wisdom of giving the enemy time to prepare their defenses, but Ryan explained his reasoning. The offer of surrender was genuine because he preferred to end this without more bloodshed, if possible. It also served a tactical purpose because the time limit would force Krax Nor to make a decision quickly, rather than waiting to see what happened. If the warlord refused, then humanity could claim it had tried diplomacy before resorting to force. The response from Krax Nor came back in 8 hours, and it was exactly what Ryan had expected. The Zentaur warlord rejected the surrender offer, and sent a message filled with threats about what would happen to human forces if they attacked his stronghold. He apparently believed that his defensive position was strong enough to hold off any assault, and seemed to think the humans would lose their nerve when faced with a fortified enemy. Ryan read the message twice, then deleted it from his system, and turned to face his bridge crew. He gave orders to prepare for immediate attack, with all ships going to full combat readiness. The tactical plan he had developed assumed the enemy would refuse surrender, and he saw no reason to delay now that the situation was clear. Kate brought up the targeting solutions on her screens, and confirmed that all ships were ready to execute the plan. Admiral Lisa Hayes received notification of the impending assault, and sent Ryan a brief message, wishing him good luck, and reminding him to bring everyone home safely. She also forwarded a message from the Council demanding that human forces delay any major offensive actions until observers could be put in place. Lisa deleted that message without bothering to respond, because she knew Ryan was already committed to the attack, and nothing the Council said would matter at this point. The human task force dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kelthar system, in a formation that looked almost casual to anyone watching on sensors. Captain Ryan Foster had positioned his 23 ships in a loose pattern that suggested confidence rather than caution, and the message was deliberate. He wanted Krax Nor to understand that humanity was not intimidated by numbers, or defensive positions or threats. Commander Kate Sullivan counted 52 enemy ships on her tactical display, along with 16 automated defense platforms and an unknown number of weapons built into the asteroid base itself. The Zentaur had clearly committed everything they had to this final stand, and the defensive setup showed more sophistication than previous engagements. Someone on the enemy side understood military tactics well enough to create overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions. Ryan studied the tactical situation for several minutes, while his ship moved deeper into the system at a steady pace. The Zentaur were waiting for the humans to commit to an attack vector before revealing their full defensive strength, which was a sensible strategy against most opponents. Unfortunately for them, Ryan had no intention of following a predictable approach pattern. He gave orders that sent his ships scattering in 6 different directions, like water flowing around a rock. The Defender led a group of destroyers on a high approach that would bring them down on the asteroid field from above, while Captain Alex Morgan took the cruiser Valiant on a low trajectory that used the system's gas giant for cover. Commander Sarah Blake aboard the destroyer. Swift led a third group straight toward the center of the defensive formation, as if conducting a suicidal frontal assault. The Zentaur commanders had to choose which threat to prioritize, and Ryan was counting on them making the wrong choice. Krax Nor watched the human ships split up, and felt a moment of satisfaction because divided forces were easier to defeat than concentrated ones. He ordered his ships to focus on the group approaching from below, since they seemed to be trying to use the gas giant's gravity well for a slingshot maneuver. Half his fleet moved to intercept, while the defense platforms tracked the Defender's high approach. The group coming straight at him looked like a diversion, so he assigned only a few ships to harass them. Sarah Blake smiled when she saw most of the enemy fleet moving away from her position and increased speed toward the asteroid field. Her orders were to draw attention and create confusion, which she was apparently succeeding at quite well. When the Zentaur ships assigned to stop her opened fire, she began evasive maneuvers that looked desperate, but were actually designed to pull the enemy further out of position. Alex Morgan brought the Valiant around the gas giant right on schedule, and found himself looking at the undefended flank of Crax Nor's formation. The enemy had committed so heavily to stopping what they thought were the main threats that they had left a gap in their coverage large enough to fly a battleship through. Alex did not waste the opportunity, and led his ships in a devastating strike against the nearest defense platforms. The platforms exploded in sequence as human missiles found their targets, and suddenly the carefully prepared defensive positions had a hole that was getting wider with each passing second. Crax Nor realized his mistake, and tried to pull ships back to cover the breach, but military formations do not change direction quickly when they are already committed to an attack. The Zentaur fleet was out of position, and Ryan Foster was not the kind of commander who let opportunities slip away. The Defender dropped into the asteroid field from above, and began systematically destroying every automated defense system Kate could find. Her targeting solutions were perfect, and the enemy installations died before they could adjust their firing patterns to account for an attack from an unexpected angle. Ryan coordinated his ship's movements with the other groups through a series of brief tactical updates that kept all human forces working together, despite being physically separated. Lieutenant Commander Ben Carter was flying his interceptor through the asteroid field, hunting for the entrance to Crax Nor's base, when he spotted something that made him smile. Several Zentaur ships were trying to flee the battle by hiding among the asteroids and waiting for a chance to escape to faster-than-light travel. Ben marked their positions and sent the data to the Defender while moving to cut off their escape route. He had learned during previous engagements that running Zentaur ships down was one of his specialties. The battle lasted 4 hours of intense combat that tested the skills and endurance of every human crew member. Commander Kate Sullivan lost count of how many targets she engaged, but her console kept a running total that climbed past 100 destroyed platforms and ships. She worked with mechanical efficiency while calling out threats and coordinating point defense against incoming missiles. The bridge crew fell into a rhythm that came from training together for years. Captain Alex Morgan's cruiser took heavy damage when 3 Zentaur ships managed to bracket the Valiant in a crossfire, but his crew kept fighting, even as hull breaches vented atmosphere into space. The chief engineer performed miracles keeping the engines online, while damage control teams sealed the worst of the breaches with emergency patches. Alex refused suggestions that he pull back to a safer position, and instead pressed the attack harder. Sarah Blake found herself in a running gunfight with a group of Zentaur raiders who had apparently decided that taking down at least one human ship would be worth dying for. The Swift's shields were hammered by concentrated fire, while Sarah maneuvered through the asteroid field at speeds that made her navigation officer nervous. She waited until the enemy ships were completely focused on her, before leading them straight into a trap, where 2 other human destroyers were waiting in ambush. Crax Nor's flagship tried to flee when it became clear that the battle was lost, but the Defender was already moving to intercept. Ryan had marked the Warlord's ship early in the engagement, and kept track of its position throughout the chaos. When Crax Nor attempted to run, Ryan was ready, and the Defender's engines flared to maximum burn. The chase lasted less than 10 minutes before the 2 ships came within weapons range. Ryan opened a communication channel and offered surrender one final time because he preferred to take prisoners when possible. Crax Nor responded by firing every weapon his ship had at the Defender in a desperate attempt to disable the human destroyer. The shields held against the barrage, and Kate Sullivan calmly targeted the enemy flagship's engines, with a precision that came from doing this job very well. Her first shot disabled the main drive, and her second shot destroyed the backup systems. The Zentaur flagship was drifting helplessly when Crax Nor made his final mistake. Rather than accept capture, he activated his ship's self-destruct sequence while broadcasting a message about how the Zentaur would never surrender to inferior species. Kate had been monitoring the enemy ship's power systems and detected the overload building in the reactor. She targeted the reactor itself and fired before the self-destruct could complete. The resulting explosion was smaller and more controlled than what Crax Nor had intended, but the Warlord was just as dead either way. The battle ended with the Zentaur base destroyed, and 70% of their fleet either captured or turned into expanding debris clouds. The survivors surrendered unconditionally when they realized that continued resistance was pointless. Human boarding teams secured the prisoners and began the process of documenting everything for the eventual war crimes trials. At the council station, Ambassador Jake Harrison received the after-action report and walked into the main chamber where the regular session was in progress. He waited politely for a break in the proceedings before requesting permission to address the assembly. Chairman Qualzen recognized him with obvious reluctance, and Jake stood to deliver his message. The Xentar threat had been eliminated, he explained, with the raiding fleet destroyed and the surviving crews in custody awaiting trial. The main base had been neutralized, and all intelligence regarding their support network had been forwarded to appropriate law enforcement agencies. The human task force would begin withdrawal from the region within 48 hours once they had confirmed no remaining threats. He delivered the information in a calm, professional tone that somehow made the achievement sound routine. The council chamber fell completely silent as delegates processed what they had just heard. 3 days was all it had taken for humanity to accomplish what the council had been debating for weeks. Ambassador Helen Price watched the reactions and saw everything from shock to relief to barely concealed anger playing across the faces of various species representatives. The Cathari delegates stood and demanded a full investigation into human military operations to ensure that proper legal standards had been maintained. Helen agreed immediately and provided access codes to the complete operational records, including sensor logs, communication transcripts, and video documentation from every engagement. The amount of data was staggering, and it would take investigators months to review everything, but Helen knew that was exactly the point. A representative from the Saurian Empire asked what would prevent humans from taking similar unilateral actions in the future, and Helen's response was simple and direct. Nothing would prevent it if the Council continued to allow threats against civilians to go unanswered while trapped in procedural debates. Humanity preferred to work through proper channels, but when those channels failed to protect innocent lives, then other options would be considered. Chairman Qualzen's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a resigned shade of gray. He asked if the human delegation had any recommendations for preventing similar situations in the future, and Jake provided a list that had been prepared weeks ago. The recommendations included faster response protocols for emergency situations and permanent task forces with authority to act without waiting for full council approval. Every suggestion was practical and well-reasoned, and most of the delegates hated them because they required giving up some degree of control. Admiral Lisa Hayes stood down the task force alert status, but kept the fleet on standby because she suspected this would not be the last time humanity needed to handle a problem the Council could not solve. She sent personal messages to every ship captain thanking them for their professionalism and dedication. The casualties had been minimal considering the scope of the operation, and every crew member was returning home safely. Captain Ryan Foster sat in his quarters aboard the Defender and wrote the after-action report that would eventually be studied in military academies across human space. He included tactical analyses of what worked and what could be improved along with recommendations for future operations. The report was thorough and honest because Ryan believed that learning from experience was how militaries got better at their jobs. 6 months later, when another crisis emerged in a different part of the galaxy, the council debate lasted less than an hour before they turned to the human delegation and politely requested assistance. Helen Price looked at Jake Harrison, and they both smiled before agreeing to help. The galaxy had learned its lesson about what happened when humans said they would handle something, and no one wanted to experience that lesson twice.